Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture on the Epic of Gilgamesh. More than 4,000 years ago, in what's today the nation of Iraq, people were working on versions of this poem about the greatest hero that the world had ever seen, King Gilgamesh of Uruk, 1/3 man, 2/3 god, tyrant, traveler, and tragic figure. He who continues to speak to us to this day, reflecting eternal values of love and friendship, courage, fear, and acceptance of death. We'll learn about this work of world literature from the leading scholar on the subject, the distinguished Professor Babylonian Dr. Andrew George of the Department of Languages and Cultures of the Near and Middle East at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Professor George is author of the critical 2-volume omnibus edition of the Gilgamesh epic that now anchors all studies of the text on rock-solid ground, as well as a prize-winning translation made available to the general public on his own insistence through Penguin Classics and the Folio Society. Many of you are probably already familiar with it. It constitutes the most up-to-date and reliable translation of the text into any language. Professor George has his training from the University of Birmingham, where he completed his doctoral dissertation on Babylonian topographical texts under the supervision of W.G. Lambert in 1985. Since 1983, he has taught Akkadian and Sumerian language and literature at the School of African and Oriental Studies, the other way around, Oriental and African Studies in London. He is a fellow of the British Academy and an honorary member of the American Oriental Society and has so far authored 9 books and more than 110 scholarly articles, several of them on tonight's topic. Following the lecture, we are fortunate to have with us an illustrious panel of 3 professors who call Harvard their home and who have all themselves worked on various aspects of the epic at one point or another. Each has agreed to offer a 5-minute perspective on a topic of their choice as a comment to Professor George's lecture. The panel consists of former William Dorr Boardman Professor of Fine Arts, Dr. Irene Winter, Hancock Professor of Hebrew and other Oriental Languages, Dr. Peter Machinist, and Ernst Birnbaum Professor of Comparative Literature, Dr. David Damrosch. Following their remarks, we will open the discussion to the audience for questions and comments. This evening's event has been organized in collaboration with a lot of institutions, as you just heard, and particularly we are grateful to the Provost Hill Fund for the Arts and Humanities who has made this possible. The background is a course for the Harvard College, A&E 103 Ancient Lives, whose 70 students have spent the afternoon with our guest, asking questions and leading discussions in preparation for their main course assignment this year, a live performance of selected parts of the epic under the sound guidance of their instructor from the American Repertory Theatre, Brennan Isley. Our lecture tonight is thus also part of a learning activity for our students on how to think about and deal with key aspects of human nature and historical development over a long span of time, and it will form an element in their interactive engagement with course topics through a personal and sensory experience with the past. As you heard, for those of you who have the time, you will also have a chance to share in this sensory journey for the following event, which will occur immediately after this lecture at the Semitic Museum. You're invited to tour the galleries and have some Mesopotamian culinary nibbles, or rather, at least its closest proxy, which is Watertown, Massachusetts. And, if you are 21, to sample the wine that we have imported from the mountains where Gilgamesh and Enkidu slew Humbaba, as well as beer brewed according to ancient recipes from Phrygia. So whether you will be joining us in the Semitic Museum or not, I welcome you and hope that you will join me in welcoming our main speaker for the evening, Professor Andrew George.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's wonderful to be here. I'm very, very happy to have been invited to address you. It's wonderful to see an almost full house, and let me express my gratitude also to the people who brought me here, the institutions who've helped do that, and to Dr. Barjamovic for the invitation that he sent me some months ago. I'm going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, Gilgamesh, subtitled Recovering the Masterpiece of Babylonian Literature, because that's what it is. But first of all, we do have to ask ourselves the question, what is Gilgamesh? Because Gilgamesh is, well, pretty much everywhere. There is a book by Theodore Ziolkowski of the University of Princeton that explains what I've just said, that Gilgamesh has really entered the artistic consciousness of the West, of modern Iraq, of Europe, of North America, because since about 1912, when the first translation into a modern language was achieved, that was reliable, artists, poets, musicians, dramatists, operettists, librettists have fed on the ancient story of Gilgamesh and turned it into their own property, which is only right. That they could do so is a sign of the humanity and importance of the ancient epic. And I hope that by the time we get to the end of my talk, it will emerge why this particular text, the Epic of Gilgamesh, 4,000 years old as it is, has had this profound influence on modern Western culture. Because I think it's fair to say that after the Bible, no other ancient Near Eastern text has been as influential on the modern world as Gilgamesh has. And so far as I know, while the Bible is a scripture and has that help of being a scripture, there is not yet any sect anywhere in the world that considers the Epic of Gilgamesh to be scripture. Though I may be wrong, of course. So Gilgamesh then is a 4,000-year-old Babylonian poem. And I thought of 5 ways that we can approach Gilgamesh, this old poem. We're going to talk then about the story. We're going to talk about archaeology and decipherment. We're going to talk about how the poem is reconstructed from all those bits that I will show you. Something about poetry to get a measure of the aesthetics of the text. And then, well, does it mean anything to us 4,000 years later? Is there a message in this ancient poem? First of all, then, the story, to give you the backbone that you need to listen to the rest. We should know what the poem says. Well, we divide it up into several chunks, and the first chunk introduces Gilgamesh, king in Uruk. Uruk, an ancient city in the south of Babylonia, now Iraq. He was an imposing giant figure, kingly, heroic, glorious. And I'm afraid the best reputation that we've got of him from the ancient world is none of those things. Here it is. We know it's Gilgamesh because he's standing on top of the head of one of his slaughtered enemies. Gilgamesh was king, but he was a tyrant. He was an autocrat who had his own way and abused his rights as a king. And it's interesting that the Babylonian poet does not seek to turn this greatest of kings and most glorious of heroes into a one-dimensional hero. He turns him instead into a human being. He's a tyrant, this man, because he's been given power and he uses it absolutely. And the gods listen to the complaints of the town of Uruk, and they send a wild man down who is in every respect the image of Gilgamesh, except that where Gilgamesh is a man of the city, Enkidu, and that is his name, is a man of the wild. The poet has to find a way of bringing Enkidu to the city to meet Gilgamesh so that he can divert his superhuman energies and stop him abusing his people. And this is done through a sequence of events involving the seduction of Enkidu by a prostitute, his humanization, turning from an animal into a man, and his socialization, first of all, in the shepherd's camp, where he learns to eat and drink like a human being and is clothed, and then his humanization into society, his socialization in the city itself. So Enkidu comes to Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh, fully intent on teaching Gilgamesh a lesson because he's heard about Gilgamesh's tyranny, and like all instinctive beings, he has a feeling of unfairness. You know, it seems to me that even small children understand the concept of fairness intuitively, and Enkidu falls into that category. He meets Gilgamesh determined to stop his abuse. They fight, they struggle, they come to a standstill. Neither is the winner, but they recognize in each other a bosom friend, and that is what they become and remain. Enkidu and Gilgamesh team up, And they leave town to go on an adventure to the cedar forest where the ogre Humbaba, there he is on the left, a representation probably of Humbaba with his wrinkly face, who guards the cedar forest over in Lebanon. Gilgamesh and Enkidu resolve to go there, to do him to death, and to fell his cedars and bring them back to Uruk. And so they do. And here is an old Babylonian plaque depicting Gilgamesh and Enkidu slaughtering Humbaba, the tree monster, in his forest before they cut down the cedars. And that is their first glorious expert of heroism. The second one is when they come back to Uruk after defeating Humbaba and chopping down his cedars. And Ishtar, the goddess of Uruk, is so impressed with the beauty of Gilgamesh that she falls in love with him, if she can fall in love, and that is a difficult proposition for a goddess like Ishtar, who is, in fact, a prostitute. She is attracted by his physique, his manliness, his beauty, and she proposes to him that he marry her. And he says, no fool would marry, no one but a fool would marry a prostitute like you. Look at what's happened to your previous lovers. They've all come unstuck. I will have nothing to do with you. And she, as the goddess of his town, Uruk, is absolutely insulted by that and runs up to her father in heaven and says, give me, Father, the bull of heaven with which to teach Gilgamesh and Enkidu a lesson. And if you don't, I shall scream so loud that the dead will arise from the netherworld and eat the living. The first, I think, occasion in human literature where zombies have been brought into play. Well, the zombies are something that her father doesn't want to have walking around the earth. He'd rather they stay in the netherworld, and he gives to his daughter the bull of heaven, the constellation Taurus, a fiery bull in the sky. She brings it down to Uruk, where it causes much damage, but in the end, of course, Gilgamesh and Enkidu defeat it and slay it, as you can see on this rather wretched clay plaque now in Berlin. And that is the point of the greatest achievement of this pair. They have slaughtered an ogre in the cedar forest, and they have slaughtered the bull of heaven. But neither is a completely, unambiguously glorious thing to have done, because the ogre was placed in the cedar forest to protect the cedar by the gods. And the bull of heaven, well, is the bull of heaven, also belonging to the gods. And while they are having a banquet in the palace after these events, the gods are in council, and Enkidu lies down to sleep, and he witnesses the council in a dream. And the gods determine that because these two heroes have behaved badly, overstepped the mark, one of them shall die, and the one that shall die shall be Enkidu. And so Enkidu falls sick, and after a long illness, in which he is partly raving and having dreams of the netherworld, he dies. And there is then a long epic funeral, only recently recovered. I think that's a desideratum in all funerals in at least the ancient Mediterranean and the ancient Near East. All epics in the ancient Mesopotamian and the ancient Near East, that you have to have a good funeral. All the grave goods are recounted and duly set up before the gods in order that Enkidu, when he gets to the netherworld, finds that the gods are on his side. And this is represented, this episode, by a grave at Abu Salabih showing a dead human being, not certainly Enkidu, in fact not at all Enkidu. And on the right, some crushed jewellery from Ur of the Chaldees, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, in the great grave pit there, the Royal Cemetery of Ur, which neatly demonstrates the richness of royal graves. Certainly Enkidu's grave was a rich one. Now Enkidu was Gilgamesh's lover. They loved each other. And the death of Enkidu brings about a huge change in Gilgamesh. He has lost the human he loved most in all the world. And this drives him crazy, not just because he's lost his friend, but also because he suddenly understands that death is real. And he fears for himself. What grows in him is a horror of death, because he knows that he too, like Enkidu, will die. And he's driven to go on a mad quest to the ends of the earth to seek the secret of immortality, because he knows that far away somewhere beyond the ends of the earth, there still lives an ancestor of his who was once king in Sumer, a different city, not Uruk, but not far away, but who still lives thousands of years later and is in fact immortal. And Gilgamesh reasons that if there is one human who became immortal, perhaps he could do that as well and get what he wants, an evasion of his own death. And so he sets out for the ends of the earth, and in the end he gets there. He's taken across the waters of death into the presence of Uttanapishti, his ancestor, who lives immortal beyond the end of the world with his wife. And Uttanapishti explains to him the fact of his own immortality, the fact that this immortality was given to him by the gods because they didn't know what else to do with him when Uttanapishti survived the great flood. Long ago in human history, when the gods resolved to wipe out mankind, and nearly succeeded, except that one among their number told Uttanapishti to build an ark, get all his family aboard, all the seeds of living things. Yes, it's the story of Noah, but it's the Babylonian original. Uttanapishti tells this story to Gilgamesh and says, I'm immortal because the gods didn't know what to do after that with me, so they put me on this island far away and gave me immortality like them, but that's not going to happen for you. You can't become immortal as I have, because it was a one-off solution to a one-off event. But why don't you try and stay awake for a week? Just to demonstrate whether you're even ready to conquer death. See whether you can conquer sleep. Gilgamesh, who has been traveling for months and months without having a wink of sleep, says, of course I can do that, and immediately falls asleep. And it's demonstrated to him by the fact that he hasn't eaten for 7 days, the food that's been put for him, that he has slept for a week, and he is distraught. And he realizes then, he begins to realize, that he's not going to become immortal any time soon. In fact, not at all. So Uttanapishti sends him on his way home, having failed in his quest for immortality, but tells him where he can get some kind of compensation. Not immortality, but a plant that, if he eats it, will make him young again, a plant of rejuvenation. And Gilgamesh dives to the bottom of the ocean, plucks the plant, but he doesn't trust what he's been told. He's very human, is Gilgamesh, as we'll find out. And he says, I'll put this in my belt and take it home to Uruk, and when I get there, I'll try it out on a young man, and if the young man gets young again, then I'll know it works, and I'll take some myself. So he goes home, and on the way, just before getting to Uruk, there's a nice pool, and he's tired and dirty and hot. And so he puts his things by the side of the pool and goes in for a dip. One of the things he puts beside the pool is the plant of rejuvenation. And a snake, sniffing the fine scent of the plant, wriggles out from where it had been hiding, picks up the plant of rejuvenation in its mouth, and wriggles away again. And as it wriggles away, it sheds its skin. And at that point, Gilgamesh knows two things. He knows, first of all, that what Uttanapishti had told him about the properties of this plant was true. But he also knows that he himself, having had this plant in his hands, has now lost it for good and has failed completely. And with that, he goes home. And that's the end of the story. Now, with that story firmly embedded in your memories, we'll go a bit further and look at the archaeology and decipherment of Gilgamesh, this 4,000-year-old narrative poem in Babylonian. And we'll ask two particular questions. Where do the sources of the poem come from? And who deciphered and published them? These are actually longer stories than they might be, or than you might expect. And it really begins in the 19th century when Austin Henry Layard, the gentleman on the left there in Bakhtiari dress, who was a gentleman adventurer, set out for Ceylon from London and didn't get there. He got to Mesopotamia, as it was then called, and he was fascinated in the ruin mounds that he saw all around him in northern Mesopotamia. One of them in particular, which was opposite the modern city of Mosul, across the Tigris. Mosul, the town that even now the Iraqi army is preparing to take back from the Islamic State in the north of Iraq. And here's a map of Mosul in 1852, and you can see opposite it a great walled enclosure, which is the ancient city of Nineveh. And within that walled enclosure, you can see two citadels, one here and one here. This is where Austin Henry Layard started to dig, because he thought these mounds, the local people say, are the ruins of ancient cities. I'm not going to go to Ceylon, I'm going to investigate these ancient cities. He dug at Nimrud first and then came back to Mosul and started digging here at this citadel mound. And on this photograph from the 1930s, you can still see the pits in the surface of the mound where he dug. Here is the Tigris flowing from the north to the south, and Mosul across the river as it was then. Later by 1989, you'd see that the city has encroached upon this flat land here, and this photograph on the right is taken from the city wall here. You can see the city wall stretching to this great mound where Layard dug in the distance. And what Layard found there was a palace of an Assyrian king called Sennacherib, the one who besieged Jerusalem in Kings. And he dug tunnels in the mound, and he found the remains of a monumental palace building, and he could follow the corridors and the chambers, the walls of the corridors and the chambers, because they were lined with great bas-relief monuments, great limestone slabs with pictorial scenes upon them and some writing, as you can see here in this lithograph, surrounding lining the walls of this particular chamber. And maybe some of you have been to the British Museum and seen these slabs. They were what attracted Mesopotamian archaeologists first and foremost to digging these mounds in Assyria, these wonderful bas-reliefs depicting the might of the Assyrian army and its conquests, and other wonderful things like the lion hunts of Ashurbanipal. But in this very building, in this very chamber here, there was, according to Layard, and here he is sitting in Western dress, drawing the bas-reliefs on these monuments, there was a mound of clay tablets, knee-deep, he said. And these clay tablets he couldn't read, but he recognized that they were covered in what was called cuneiform writing, and he sent them back to the British Museum in 1850 and another batch in 1853, and they became the foundation of the science of Assyriology, because they were tablets from Assyria. So the discipline which is interested in deciphering cuneiform in Mesopotamia is called Assyriology. Assyriology got nowhere fast because there wasn't anyone in the British Museum who could cope with 20,000 tablets of cuneiform writing until 1866, when a young man called George Smith was employed to start making sense of these things. But let's have a look at what they look like. This is a tablet of Gilgamesh from that pile of tablets in that room in Sennacherib's palace. It actually belongs to Sennacherib's grandson, Ashurbanipal. It has a label here saying, property of Ashurbanipal, king of the world, king of Assyria. But it's a manuscript of Gilgamesh, tablet 6, the episode when Gilgamesh and Enkidu defeat the bull of heaven. I've also illustrated here from a different time, a different period, a different place, a mound of tablets to show you that when clay tablets fall from shelves, as they're typically stored on, they break on the floor. And you can see that this one is also broken, not only the two parts that you can see there, but also the bit that's missing, because originally this would have had 3 columns of text, 1, 2, 3, but the third column has almost gone. And that's a perennial problem besetting Assyriologists, that we work with broken sources. Now, George Smith, employed in 1866 to make sense of all these tablets, was an extraordinary Assyriologist. He was the first man to draw a salary as an Assyriologist, because he was paid by the British Museum only to work on cuneiform tablets. In 150 years ago, so I reckon he's the first salaried Assyriologist. And after a few years, he discovered all sorts of wonderful things. You can still see the marks on the tablets: M for mythology in pencil, H for historical, and R for religious. And among the M mythological tablets were tablets about a hero that he called Izdubar. We now call him Gilgamesh. And he discovered that there was a narrative of the flood in the Izdubar legends, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and he gave a paper on it to the Society of Biblical Antiquaries, is that right? No, the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London, and it caused a complete sensation, because this was very clearly a narration of the flood story that was closely related to this story in Genesis, the story of Noah. But it wasn't complete. The Babylonian story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Izdubar as Smith called it, bits were missing, so the Daily Telegraph provided 1,000 guineas for George Smith to go out to Iraq and to find the missing piece, as if it was as easy as that. But he did actually go to Nineveh twice, and he did find a missing piece of the flood story, believe it or not. Not actually Gilgamesh, though he didn't know that at the time, but another flood story embedded in another long narrative poem of mythological content. That was so successful that the Daily Telegraph said, "Job achieved, come home immediately." But he went back and bought a lot of tablets in Baghdad, and these were not Assyrian tablets from the north, from Mosul. They were from the south, and they were a different kind of tablet, slightly later in a different script, but the same body of material. That's to say, there were Gilgamesh tablets in there, and the British Museum set about buying these things. They were excavated by the ordinary people in the mounds of Iraq for commercial reasons. The local people sensed that there was a market for these things. George Smith had bought some, so they started digging them up wherever they could find them and selling them to the British Museum, and the British Museum bought 20,000. They later sent Hormuzd Rassam, an Assyrian Christian who had helped Laird at Nineveh, to conduct his own excavations in the south, in these cities around about Baghdad, just south of Baghdad, including Babylon. And Rassam brought back another 50,000 Babylonian tablets. So by this time, there were 90,000 tablets in the British Museum and 2 people who could read them. And it's still a bit like that. Assyriology is beset by 2 problems: vast quantities of tablets, something like 500,000 in the museums of the world, and a tiny number of people who can decipher them. So, in this way, we ensure that Assyriology will last forever. Because we're still trying to even work on the first 10% of that 500,000.